Well, welcome to Christian Answers. My name is Jeff Short, and today I'm going to be talking about a subject that I don't hear a lot of people talking about, and I think that a lot of Christians don't realize what's actually happening in this situation. And I'm talking about Christian publishing houses. I don't think a lot of Christians realize that some of the major Christian publishing houses are not even owned by Christians. They're not even run at the very top by Christians. And I was amazed when I realized this a few years back, and I wanted to talk about it today. What I'm doing today is I'm going to be reading an article from Christian Headlines that appeared June 25th, 2014. So it's about 5 years old. So this is the state of publishing houses, Christian books, and Christian material about 5 years ago. So it's probably, I haven't heard any major shakeups in the Christian publishing world in the last 5 years, but there could have been a number of them. But this is going back 5 years ago. And this article does a good job in exposing the state of Christian publishing. Now, why should this be an issue for Christians, for churches, Christian organizations, and so forth? Why is this even an issue? Okay, Christian publishing companies owned by secular media corporations, why is that a problem? Well, I think a lot of people realize that ultimately, if your parent company is a secular organization that is basically the bottom line is money, there is the risk and there's the real possibility that the Christian message will be compromised. And we've seen that already happening. Let me give you an example. Let me read this article and we'll go through it and make some comments. It says, "Can Christian publishers owned by secular companies stay Christian?" by Warren Cole Smith. Warren Smith has written this for World News Service. And his article begins, "When Waterbrook Multnomah Publishing Group published Matthew Vine's book, God and the Gay Christian, in April, Jerry Johnson had a problem." And Johnson is the new president of National Religious Broadcasters, and Waterbrook Multnomah was an associate member. The ethics statement of the NRB is clear. Members must adhere to the broadly evangelical statement of faith that applies to the material the members produce. So if you're in Christian publishing, you have to adhere to the basic Christian doctrine and moral standards of historic Christianity. And that's how you can be a member of the National Religious Broadcasters. If you're not going to adhere to those, you can't be a member. And so here's a publishing company, and you might recognize the name Multnomah and a lot of different books that Christians read. I've got just countless numbers of books put out by Multnomah Press in the Pacific Northwest. That's where they're headquartered. And it's generally a solid biblical Christian publishing house. So Christians look at that and say, oh, good, I can trust Multnomah to do the right thing and not publish heresy, apostasy, false teachings, false practices, and so on and so forth. You would think. But, and I also have some books by the Waterbrook imprint. And again, that is a more recent and newer Christian book publishing company. I think it was based at first out of Colorado Springs, where I used to live for 10 years or so, decades ago. So these are publishing labels, publishing names that are generally well trusted in the evangelical world because of what they published in the past. But now there is a problem because this Waterbrook Multnomah Publishing Group published a pro-homosexual book that is contrary to the teachings of Christianity and the teachings of the Bible and historic Christianity. So it's false teaching, and it's false teaching put out there by a Christian publishing company. So Jerry Johnson has a problem with that, which he should, as the president of the NRB. And Johnson later, it says, wrote in a memo to his board that Waterbrook Multnomah had a good record of publishing evangelicals that share the doctrinal commitments of NRB. While acknowledging that positive track record, the question remains, what role, if any, did Waterbrook Multnomah have in this pro-homosexuality publication? So, in other words, who is responsible for this? Who in the Waterbrook Multnomah Christian Publishing Company is responsible for publishing false teachings? After conversations with Waterbrook Multnomah's leadership, Johnson presented the publisher with a choice. I told them that if they wanted to remain NRB associate members, I would have to refer the matter to our ethics committee for review, or they could agree to resign their membership. They agreed to resign immediately. Very strange. You would have thought that a Christian group would have said, oh, wait, we want to, if we're being held accountable for something we published that wasn't right, we want to make this right. We want to do an internal review and find out which editor passed this on and why they passed it on and get to the bottom of this. And no, we want to stay with the Christian Accountability National Religious Broadcasters Group, so we'll do whatever we need to do. No, they just immediately resigned. They said, okay, we're through. We're done with National Religious Broadcasters, which is a bad sign. In other words, they have a book publishing agenda. They were held accountable by another Christian group that they are a part of, and they refuse to cooperate in any kind of accountability for what they were publishing. It says the story of Waterbrook Multnomah's resignation from NRB is a case study in the complicated issues facing the Christian publishing industry. To begin with, consider this. Neither Waterbrook nor Multnomah published Vine's controversial book. The newly formed Convergent Books published God and the Gay Christian. However, for Jerry Johnson, this distinction made no difference. Stephen W. Cobb serves as the chief publishing executive for both groups. This issue comes down to NRB members producing unbiblical material, regardless of the label under which they do it. So in other words, this book, this false teaching book, was published, but it was published under a newly formed label, Convergent Books. So it's still under the authority of Waterbrook and Multnomah, but it's not directly tied to them, and it's not, the name doesn't appear Waterbrook or Multnomah. It's a new, never heard before book label called Convergent Books. And that's supposed to, I guess, in the eyes of some people, distance the Christian publishers from any false teachings or connection with heresy or apostasy or whatever. But the NRB people realize, hey, wait, just because you change the name of a label doesn't make it okay. You're still a Christian publishing company, and you're still putting this out. Whether your name is on it or some other newly invented Christian publishing label is put on it, it's still you, and you are held accountable. And you have to either decide, we're going to continue on as Christian publishers, or we're going to cut ties with any accountability and be on our own independent publishing venture. And that's apparently what Waterbrook Multnomah decided to do. Now the article goes on. Was the issue further complicated by the fact that Multnomah, Waterbrook, and Convergent are all a part of Crown Publishing Group, which is a part of the publishing giant Penguin Random House? And that Penguin Random House, which had revenue of more than $3 billion last year, is owned by the privately held German company Bertelsmann, which did more than $20 billion in revenue last year, with more than $1 billion in profits. So here, according to this report, Multnomah, the Christian publishing company, Waterbrook, another well-known Christian publishing label, is ultimately owned by Penguin Random House, which is a secular book company. And that secular book company is owned by the German company, mega company, Bertelsmann, huge company, secular company, has nothing to do with Christianity. So, in other words, a Christian label that puts out Christian books was bought up by a secular publishing company, which is owned by a secular, huge mega corporation. Ultimately, the Christian books are being published by secular non-Christians for the purpose of making money. Now, that should raise all kinds of red flags. And so it does, and this article addresses that. It goes on. Whatever the answer to these questions, they could easily apply to almost the entire Christian publishing industry. This is the problem. This is the alarming part of this. According to this article, almost the entire Christian publishing industry is owned by secular, non-Christian, money-making, for-profit corporations. That is a shocking truth. Let's go on. The consolidation began in 1988 when Zondervan, this is a mega publishing house for Christian books. I think on my shelf, if you to go through there, basically half of all of the books on my shelf, Christian books on my shelf, are published by Zondervan. This is a huge Christian publishing company. But in 1988, when Zondervan was bought by HarperCollins, remember HarperCollins, the textbook company, the big secular book publishing company, which is itself owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. HarperCollins also bought the largest bookseller in Christian publishing, Thomas Nelson, in 2012. So Thomas Nelson, if you look on your shelf, if you're a Christian and you go look on your shelf and you see Zondervan books, which I'm sure you'll find very easily, and if you go on your shelf and you look for Thomas Nelson Bible publishing company, these are all owned by secular organizations. They're not owned by Christian organizations. They're owned by secular organizations. Marvin Paget is a longtime Christian publisher insider. From 1997 to 2005, he was editorial vice president at Crossway Books and then filled a similar position at Presbyterian and Reformed until his retirement in 2012. He came out of retirement to lead Great Commission Publishers, which is a nonprofit publishing venture of the Presbyterian Church in America, PCA, and Orthodox Presbyterian Church, OPC. And this is what he says. I attended the Christian Bookseller Association Convention in 1988 when the hot news on the floor was the acquisition of Zondervan. He said, "We were asking the same questions then, so this is not new." What are those questions? The same questions. What will this do to the integrity of Christian publishing? How will this affect what is delivered to the Christian public? You normally trust certain publishing houses. When I went to seminary, when I went to college, at Wheaton College, we quickly learned that there were probably a half a dozen to a dozen Christian publishing companies that you could generally trust to sort of weed out all of the, I would say, false teaching, heretical, apostate, directly contradictory teachings of biblical Christianity. So, in other words, if you want to go out there into the secular world and go to a Barnes & Noble religious section, and you want to go to a religious section in Amazon's web page, Amazon.com, and look through the books on a certain topic, you really don't know what you're going to get, because you might get a radical liberal perspective on something that teaches, for example, that the Bible is full of contradictions, it can't be trusted, or all these false teachings. And so you want, as a Christian, a way to sort of weed out the bad teachings. You want sort of a filter, a search engine, a filter to sort of get you in the right direction without spending a lot of money on buying books that are really not very good books, and don't help your faith, that hurt your faith and contradict your faith and actually tear down your faith. You want things that build your faith up. So you go to the Christian book publishing world and you trust about a half a dozen or a dozen Christian book publishers. For example, you trust more or less InterVarsity Press. Has generally been a solid book publishing company. Zondervan has been a fairly good book publishing. Baker Books. Multnomah was, for a longest time, a very good publishing company. And you can go on. Thomas Nelson, and so on and so forth. You just keep going on. And you're going to run into 6 to 12 to 15 or so solidly Christian publishing houses that, if you got a book from these publishing houses, you could more or less figure and trust that this is going to be somewhat helpful and build your faith up, not tear it down. Now, it's not always the case, because, as we've seen here, there has been slipping in the standards of Christian orthodoxy among the publishing companies. And you're going to run into, you're going to run into some false teachings, you're going to run into some heretical ideas and questionable practices and so forth in some of the books and some of the authors. It's almost impossible to totally screen out all of the harmful content. But these publishers traditionally, historically, have done a pretty good job. And so when I was a college student at Wheaton College, I learned which publishing companies were pretty solid. Then when I went to seminary, that whole process of learning what publishing houses put out pretty good books continued. In whether it's the popular books or the more academic-oriented books. But now the question is, how long will these publishing houses, Christian publishing houses, how long can they be trusted? Because they're not owned by Christians. They're not ultimately, the decisions are not ultimately made by Christians who will get published and who won't in these publishing houses. Paget, this man who's an insider, the article goes on, Paget admitted, though, that the gloomiest predictions about Zondervan have not come to pass. I think Zondervan had the sense to put safeguards in place that allowed them to control their own fate, Paget said. And Rupert Murdoch had the sense not to tamper with the goose that is laying a golden egg. So in other words, 1988, a lot of these conglomerates bought up Christian publishing houses. Now, why they were sold, I don't know. Maybe the Christians who ran these organizations felt that the books could have a wider distribution under a larger mega corporation funding the efforts. I hope it's not just because you could make a ton of money by selling your Christian publishing company. I hope it's not purely dollars and cents that cause these Christian publishing companies to sell. But I'm not sure exactly why Zondervan decided to sell itself to Rupert Murdoch. But this insider says that since the buyout, since the big merger of a number of some of the biggest Christian publishing companies with secular organizations, he says that the gloomiest predictions about Zondervan have not come to pass. So in other words, the Christian books have pretty much continued on in their Christian orthodoxy for the most part. And it's because that he thinks that Zondervan placed in the agreement, the buyout agreement, that they would have safeguards in place in which they would set the standards, and that the parent company would just simply allow them to run it as if it were up to the Christians. And then Rupert Murdoch, he says, had the good sense of not messing with the formula that was producing so much money, because Christians were buying these solidly Christian books. And Rupert Murdoch said, okay, just keep doing what you're doing. Even though I own your company, keep doing what you're doing. I won't tamper with it. Paget noted that for-profit is not a dirty word, even to so-called nonprofit or publishers. Paget says that while the mission comes first for nonprofit organizations, getting at least to break even is what allows us to keep doing what we do. That makes sense. You know, you have to be able to pay the bills and cover your costs and pay your salaries of the workers and pay the authors and get everybody paid in order to have Christian books put out there for people to read. So if you're so worried about just getting the message out, you may neglect the nuts and bolts of running a business and then go out of business, and then no books from the Christian perspective in your company are going to be put out there because you ran yourself out of business. So you have to run a business while at the same time keeping the message pure and biblical. Bob Freiling of InterVarsity Press said the biggest changes the large publishers have had on the industry has been the greater competition for brand name evangelical authors and agents who are being wooed by the greater resources of these companies. Freiling said that also means it's getting harder to publish either first-time authors or those who don't have a large public platform but have important things to say. So in other words, since the large mega corporations have bought out these Christian publishing companies, it's harder for the little guy to get published because the mega corporations want to go with the well-known authors, and they're willing to shell out a lot of money for these authors, some of the big ones like James Dobson and like some of the most well-known pastors and Christian leaders. They're willing to pay a lot of money to them rather than take a chance on some unknown author. And that is the safe and easy way to go, and that seems to be what these big mega corporations that bought the Christian publishing companies want to do. Of course, they want to make money. And so that's a problem. Such innovations as self-publishing and print-on-demand have theoretically made it easier for first-time authors to get in print, but the proliferation of books that these technologies enable make it harder to break through. So, in other words, you have a lot of little guys writing books, and it's easier to get your book published because of self-publishing tools, but since it's easier to get self-published, more people are getting self-published, and it makes your book harder to get attention. So that's a problem. As for the reader, self-publishing provides even fewer safeguards of theological orthodoxy. Now, it does say that most of the major Christian publishers had an opportunity to publish, for example, The Shack, but turned it down in part because of its theological problems. Such evangelical luminaries as Al Mohler, Chuck Colson, and Norman Geisler warned evangelical readers away from The Shack, but only after it became a publishing phenomenon. So it was good that the Christian publishing companies didn't or wouldn't be willing to publish The Shack because it's heretical. It fools around with the idea of the Trinity and makes one of the members of the Trinity a woman, and it just does all kinds of things that you shouldn't do with the theological truths of the Bible. All of this points to an unsettled future for the book publishing industry, especially for Christian publishers who maintain fidelity to Scripture. That's nothing new. Also not new is the practice of Christian publishers being unequally yoked to secular business partners. In the 19th century, for example, Thomas Nelson published all manner of non-Christian material, including some of the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame. Here's what is new. Today, in the modern era of publicly traded companies, maximizing shareholder value now rather than down the road minimizes long-term thinking. In such an environment, as Marvin Paget noted, there is an inescapable connect between a company whose sole end is profit and that of a Christian ministry. That's a disconnect, inescapable disconnect. So, in other words, there is a conflict of interest between publishing biblical truth that speaks perhaps prophetically to our culture and making money. And if you look, for example, of John the Baptist in the New Testament, when he was calling out and rebuking Herod for his adultery, he wasn't thinking about making money. He wasn't thinking about anything other than getting the truth out there. And so when Christian publishing companies are thinking of anything other than putting the biblical truth out there, they are going to run into trouble. Now, so far, the greatest egregious example of this conflict of interest is when the Waterbrook Multnomah Publishing Group published this pro-homosexual book by Matthew Vines. That is a mistake. That is a huge mistake. But it looks like that since that line has already been crossed, and since it seems like they got away with it, we're probably going to see more and more and more Christian publishing companies owned by secular media corporations crossing that line, testing the water, seeing how far the Christian public will put up with it, seeing if it affects sales, seeing if the bad publicity generated from crossing the lines is enough to hurt the profits. And if those lines that are crossed for the sake of making money are found to be safe, they're found that the company can endure that, the Christians will accept that, and people will be okay with that, then we're going to see more and more compromises. That's the way compromise works. It isn't like some Christian publishing company will come up with this grossly heretical book and just throw it out there and then have it blow up in their face and Christians become outraged. No. What they're going to do is start nibbling at the edges, and they're going to start publishing a little heresy here, and then maybe for a while no heresy, and then a little more heresy here and a little less heresy, and then more and more, and they're going to keep pushing the boundaries until there's this watered down mishmash of truth and heresy, and Christians are going to be like the frog in the kettle. They're just, the water is heating up rapidly, but they can't feel it because it's over time slowly getting hotter and hotter and hotter until they're boiled. So we need to keep this in prayer, and we need to watch carefully because we don't know what the future will hold, but it doesn't look good. And we need to keep this in prayer and be vigilant and be careful about what we read. Even if it's coming from a Christian publisher, check it out, make sure, compare it with Scripture. Don't just trust the label Christian. Check it out, see if it truly is Christian. Well, I hope that's been helpful, and we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.